The letter arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the wooden shutters. Tanaka Heizaemon held the thin paper in hands that had stopped shaking only because he willed them still. The rice harvest had come in at record levels across 3 provinces. Prices had fallen by 40% in a single week. The forward contracts he had signed in the summer now represented obligations he could not possibly fulfill. His losses exceeded 3,000 ryo. Tanaka Heizaemon had inherited his father's rice brokerage in the 3rd year of the Kyōhō era. The business occupied a 2-story structure on a street near the Dojima Rice Exchange in Osaka. The ground floor housed the shop where clerks recorded transactions in thick ledgers. The upper floor contained living quarters for Heizaemon, his wife Otsune, their 2 sons, and Otsune's elderly mother. The neighbourhood surrounding the exchange formed the commercial heart of Osaka. Rice brokers, money changers, and wholesale merchants operated from buildings that lined narrow streets. Porters moved through the lanes carrying goods between warehouses and shops. The smell of the nearby canal mixed with cooking fires and the musty scent of stored grain. Voices negotiated prices, shouted orders, exchanged news. Heizaemon rose each morning before dawn. He washed his face with cold water from a ceramic basin. He dressed in a dark blue cotton kimono appropriate to his station as a merchant. The fabric was of good quality but not ostentatious. Sumptuary laws restricted merchants from wearing silk or certain colours regardless of their wealth. Heizaemon followed these regulations carefully. Attention from officials could bring scrutiny to business practices best conducted with discretion. He descended the narrow stairs to the shop floor. His 2 clerks arrived shortly after. They lit oil lamps that cast yellow light across the account books. Heizaemon reviewed the previous day's transactions while his clerks prepared tea. The tea was bancha, a common grade made from older leaves. They drank from plain ceramic cups. Breakfast consisted of rice with pickled vegetables and miso soup. Otsune prepared the meal in the small kitchen behind the shop. She served her husband first, then the clerks, then the family. The rice came from their own stores. Its quality exceeded what most townspeople ate. This was one of the privileges of the rice trade, access to good rice regardless of market conditions. The workday began when merchants and agents started arriving at the exchange. The Dojima Rice Exchange operated under a charter from the shogunate. It had been formally established nearly a century earlier, though rice trading in Osaka extended much further back. The exchange provided a regulated market where daimyo could sell rice from their domains, and merchants could purchase it for distribution. Heizaemon's business involved several types of transactions. He bought rice directly from daimyo agents for resale to retailers and wholesalers in Osaka and surrounding regions. He also dealt in rice futures, purchasing contracts for rice that would be delivered after the autumn harvest. These forward contracts allowed daimyo to receive money in advance against future production. They also allowed merchants to speculate on price movements. The physical rice itself moved through a separate network. Heizaemon maintained relationships with warehouse operators who stored grain. When he purchased rice, it often remained in these warehouses. The rice moved between different owners through paperwork rather than physical transport. Actual delivery occurred only when a final purchaser needed the grain for consumption or processing. The morning hours involved meeting with various parties who had business to conduct. A daimyo agent might arrive seeking to sell a quantity of rice held in storage. They would negotiate price based on quality, quantity, and current market conditions. Heizaemon would inspect samples, assess demand, calculate profit margins, and make an offer. If terms were acceptable, his clerk would draft a contract and record the transaction in the account books. Other merchants came seeking to purchase rice from Heizaemon's inventory. These negotiations involved similar elements, but reversed. Heizaemon had to judge what price the market would bear while ensuring adequate profit. He had to maintain relationships with regular customers, while not allowing personal connections to undermine business sense. The forward contract business operated differently. In late spring and summer, before the autumn harvest, daimyo needed money to cover various expenses. They would offer contracts for rice delivery after harvest at prices determined in advance. Merchants who purchased these contracts assumed risk. If harvest conditions were poor and prices rose, the contracts proved profitable. If harvest was abundant and prices fell, losses could be substantial. Heizaemon had engaged in forward contract trading for 15 years. His father had taught him to approach such speculation carefully. Purchase contracts only from domains with reliable production. Diversify across multiple regions to reduce risk from localized weather problems. Never commit more capital than could be absorbed if prices moved unfavorably. Maintain reserves to cover obligations. These rules had served Heizaemon well. He had prospered modestly, accumulating enough wealth to provide comfortably for his family and maintain his position in merchant society. His sons would inherit a viable business and good reputation. His daughter had married into another merchant family with an appropriate dowry. The business generated steady income that exceeded his expenses by a comfortable margin. The spring of Kyōhō 18 had presented what appeared to be an unusual opportunity. Weather patterns in the winter suggested conditions favourable for an excellent harvest. Too favourable. Heizaemon's experience told him that if harvests across multiple regions came in at high levels simultaneously, rice prices could fall significantly. The market would be flooded with supply. This created potential for profit through a different strategy. Rather than avoiding forward contracts when prices might fall, a merchant could profit by selling contracts he did not yet own. If prices fell as expected, he could purchase rice at the lower price and deliver it against contracts sold at the higher forward price. The difference represented profit. This approach required careful calculation. The merchant had to be confident that prices would indeed fall. He had to have access to sufficient capital to purchase the rice when needed. He had to ensure the timing worked so rice could be acquired and delivered when contracts matured. The risks were considerable, but so were potential rewards. Heizaemon had discussed the situation with two other merchants he trusted. They had examined weather patterns, crop reports from various domains, and historical price data. They had concluded that the probability of a large harvest and falling prices exceeded 70%. The potential profit, if their analysis proved correct, could reach 1,000 ryo or more. His colleagues had decided to take modest positions. They sold forward contracts equivalent to perhaps 20% of their annual trading volume. This represented a significant speculation, but one they could manage if circumstances proved unfavourable. They encouraged Heizaemon to similar restraint. Heizaemon had made a different choice. His calculations suggested this represented a rare opportunity. Such market conditions emerge perhaps once in a generation. A cautious position would generate modest profits. A substantial commitment could transform his family's financial position. His sons could expand the business. His grandchildren would have advantages he had never possessed. He had sold forward contracts for nearly 8,000 koku of rice. This represented roughly 3 times his normal annual trading volume. The contracts obligated him to deliver specified quantities of rice at specified prices following the autumn harvest. The prices reflected current market rates, plus a premium for forward delivery. If rice prices fell by 20 or 30% as he expected, he could purchase the necessary rice for significantly less than the contracts required purchasers to pay him. The profit would be enormous. His colleagues had warned this violated the principle of never committing more than one could afford to lose. Heizaemon had dismissed their concerns. The analysis was sound. The weather patterns were clear. The probability of prices rising rather than falling was minimal. He had managed risk for his entire career. This was not recklessness. This was recognizing opportunity and having the courage to act decisively. The summer passed. Weather remained favorable for growing rice. Reports from various domains suggested strong crops developing. Rice prices in the spot market remained relatively stable as markets awaited harvest results. Heizaemon maintained his normal business activities while watching for any signs his calculations had been wrong. In the 8th month, the harvest began. Initial reports suggested very good yields in most regions. This was consistent with Heizaemon's expectations. He waited for more complete information before taking action. The spot price of rice declined modestly as early harvest rice entered the market, still within expected range. The 9th month brought more comprehensive harvest data. Yields in many domains exceeded historical averages by substantial margins. Weather throughout the growing season had been nearly perfect. Not a single major region reported significant problems. The total rice production for the year would be among the highest in recent memory. This represented exactly what Heizaemon had predicted. The market was about to be flooded with supply. Prices would fall. His forward contracts obligated purchasers to pay prices 30 or 40% above where the market would settle. His profit would be exceptional. Then the weather changed. The 10th month typically brought cold, dry conditions. Instead, unseasonably warm, humid air moved across the main island. This created ideal conditions for rice spoilage and storage. Domains that had harvested early began reporting problems with grain quality. Rice that had been properly dried and stored started showing signs of mould and deterioration. The problem spread rapidly. Storage facilities throughout multiple regions discovered they had to discard significant quantities of damaged rice. The abundant harvest suddenly looked less abundant. Domains began calculating that their saleable rice would be substantially less than initial production figures suggested. The spot price of rice stopped falling. Within a week it began rising. Within 2 weeks it had returned to pre-harvest levels. The market reassessed the situation. The total amount of good quality rice available for sale was not excessive. It was perhaps even slightly below normal levels when spoilage was accounted for. Heizaemon watched these developments with growing anxiety. His forward contracts obligated him to deliver specific quantities of rice. He had planned to purchase that rice at depressed prices following a harvest glut. Those depressed prices had never materialized. Instead, prices were rising. He would have to purchase rice at current market rates to fulfill his delivery obligations. Those rates were higher than the prices specified in his forward contracts. He had calculated his potential profit based on the spread between high forward prices and expected low spot prices. That spread had not just narrowed, it had reversed. He would lose money on every unit of rice he delivered. The losses on 8,000 koku of rice at current prices would be catastrophic. He spent a sleepless night calculating exactly how catastrophic. His assets consisted of the business property, inventory, outstanding receivables, and cash reserves. His total worth was approximately 1,500 ryo. His obligations under the forward contracts at current market prices exceeded 4,000 ryo. Even if he liquidated everything he owned, he would still owe creditors nearly 3,000 ryo. Merchant bankruptcy was not uncommon in Osaka. The complexity of rice trading and the leverage inherent in forward contracts meant that significant losses could accumulate quickly. When a merchant could not meet obligations, a process existed to settle accounts. The Merchant Guild would appoint administrators to inventory assets, contact creditors, and distribute whatever value could be recovered. The merchant would lose his business and likely face severe social consequences, but creditors would receive partial payment at least. Heizaemon understood this process. He had witnessed other merchants go through it. He also understood what it meant for his family. His sons would not inherit the business. They would likely be unable to work as merchants. His daughter's marriage could be affected if her family connection to a bankrupt merchant created problems. His wife would live the remainder of her life in reduced circumstances. His mother-in-law, dependent on his household, would suffer in her final years. These consequences extended beyond his immediate family. His clerks would lose their positions. He employed several people in various capacities. They depended on him for their livelihoods. Merchants who had trusted him with their business would suffer losses from his failure. The forward contracts had counterparties who had made their own calculations based on his ability to perform. The autumn morning when he received the final harvest reports was the morning when his situation became fully clear. The frost on the shutters melted as the sun rose. The street outside filled with the usual sounds of commercial activity. His clerks arrived and lit the lamps. His wife prepared breakfast. Everything appeared normal on the surface. But the letter he held documented the precise quantities of rice he was obligated to deliver over the coming months. The current market prices for that rice exceeded the contract prices by margins that made recovery impossible. He had gambled his family's entire future on a calculation that had proven wrong. The rare opportunity he thought he had recognized had been an illusion. He faced ruin. Part 2. Navigating Catastrophe. Heizaemon did not tell his family immediately. He instructed his clerks to continue normal operations. He met with merchants who arrived to conduct business. He reviewed account books and approved transactions. He presented the appearance of a man managing an ordinary day in a functioning business. Internally his mind worked through possibilities. Perhaps rice prices would fall again if more harvest came to market. Perhaps the spoilage problems were not as widespread as early reports suggested. Perhaps he could negotiate extensions on his delivery dates, buying time for market conditions to improve. Perhaps some creditors would accept partial payment or revised terms. None of these possibilities seemed likely. The rice market had adjusted to reality. Prices reflected actual available supply. not theoretical harvest quantities. The spoilage had been documented by multiple domains. No reason existed to expect significant price declines. His contracts specified clear delivery dates and prices. The counterparties had no incentive to revise terms that favoured them. A different approach occurred to him. He could simply fail to perform on the contracts, declare himself unable to deliver the rice, let the counterparties seek legal remedy. The process would take time. Perhaps during that time something might change. Perhaps he could protect some assets. Perhaps bankruptcy proceedings would prove less severe than he feared. This approach felt wrong immediately. His father had taught him that a merchant's reputation represented his most valuable asset. Trust enabled commerce. Parties entered contracts believing the other side would perform. If merchants routinely defaulted on obligations when circumstances proved unfavourable, the entire system would collapse. Osaka's rice market functioned because participants honoured commitments, even when doing so created personal hardship. Heizaemon had benefited from this system his entire career. Daimyo agents had trusted him with large transactions. Other merchants had accepted his word in deals done without written contracts. His credit with moneylenders reflected their confidence in his integrity. To simply walk away from obligations would violate everything he believed about proper conduct in commerce. It would also be impractical. The Merchant Guild would not look favourably on someone who defaulted willfully, rather than making genuine effort to satisfy creditors. His son's future ability to work in commerce would be damaged more by perception that their father had behaved dishonourably than by simple business failure. The distinction mattered in merchant society. He needed to face the situation directly, inform creditors of his circumstances, propose a plan for settling accounts, seek cooperation in managing the process in a way that minimised damage to all parties. This represented the correct approach ethically. It might also preserve some possibility of maintaining standing in the community. The next morning, Heizaemon visited the largest of his creditors. The man operated a money-lending business from an office near the exchange. Heizaemon had borrowed from him multiple times to finance rice purchases. The relationship spanned years and included many successful transactions. Current outstanding debt exceeded 800 Oreo. He explained his situation candidly. The forward contracts he had sold, the expectation of falling prices that had proven wrong, the current loss position, the insufficiency of his assets to cover all obligations, his intention to liquidate everything available and distribute proceeds fairly among creditors, his request for time to manage this process in an orderly fashion. The moneylender listened without expression. He asked specific questions about quantities, prices, timing, and assets. He took notes on a small writing pad. When Heizaemon finished, the man was silent for several moments. Then he spoke. "You took an inappropriate level of risk. Your calculation was not entirely unreasonable, but your position size was reckless. You violated basic principles of careful speculation. This failure is your responsibility." Heizaemon acknowledged this. He had known when he made the decision that he was exceeding prudent limits. He had convinced himself the opportunity justified the risk. He had been wrong. He accepted full responsibility. The moneylender continued. "However, you are addressing the situation honourably. Many merchants in your position would have delayed, concealed their circumstances, attempted to shift losses to others. You are presenting accurate information and proposing to meet your obligations to the extent possible. This matters." He outlined what he expected. Heizaemon would provide complete documentation of all assets and liabilities. A representative of the creditors, likely appointed by the Merchant Guild, would verify this information. Heizaemon would liquidate assets in an orderly fashion to maximise recovery. Proceeds would be distributed proportionally among creditors. The process would be completed within 6 months. In exchange for this cooperation, the moneylender would not pursue legal action immediately. He would work with other creditors to coordinate the settlement process. He would not petition the guild to strip Heizaemon of his merchant status immediately. If Heizaemon fulfilled his commitments in managing the liquidation, the moneylender would provide a statement acknowledging his honourable conduct. This statement might help Heizaemon's sons eventually find positions in merchant houses despite their father's failure. Heizaemon accepted these terms. He visited 5 other major creditors over the following days. Most offered similar arrangements. One was more hostile, threatening immediate legal action. 2 were more sympathetic, suggesting they might accept less than proportional payment if it helped him preserve something for his family. He treated all with the same transparency, providing the same documentation and making the same commitments. The Merchant Guild appointed an administrator to oversee the process. The administrator was an older merchant whom Heizaemon knew slightly. The man had a reputation for fairness and attention to detail. He arrived at Heizaemon's shop with 2 assistants. They spent 3 days reviewing account books, inventory records, property documents, and financial statements. The administrator's final assessment confirmed what Heizaemon had calculated. Total assets, if liquidated at reasonable prices, would generate approximately 1,500 ryo. Total liabilities exceeded 4,000 ryo. The shortfall was insurmountable. Even if assets sold for better than expected prices, creditors would receive less than 40% of what they were owed. The administrator outlined the liquidation plan. The shop property would be sold. This would generate the largest single asset recovery, perhaps 600 ryo. The rice inventory currently held would be sold immediately at market rates. Outstanding receivables would be collected aggressively. Any personal possessions of value would be sold. The only exception was basic household items and simple clothing appropriate to greatly reduced circumstances. Heizaemon had to inform his family. He chose an evening after the shop had closed. His wife, sons and mother-in-law gathered in the upstairs living quarters. He explained what had happened. The forward contracts, the miscalculation, the losses, the liquidation process, what it meant for their future. His wife Otsun listened without interruption. She had managed the household for 20 years. She had raised children, cared for her mother, performed countless tasks that allowed Heizaemon to focus on business. She had accepted the constraints of merchant life, including the social limitations and the uncertainty that came with commercial activities. Now she learned that her husband had lost everything through a speculation that had gone wrong. Her response was quiet and controlled. She asked practical questions. Where would they live after the property sold? How would they buy food? What would become of their sons? She did not reproach him for the decision that had led to disaster. She did not express anger at being forced into poverty. She absorbed the information and began thinking about what needed to be done. His elder son was 22 years old. He had been training to eventually take over the rice brokerage business. He had learned to evaluate rice quality, negotiate with daimyo agents, maintain account books, and manage clerk relationships. That training was now useless. He would not inherit a business. He would need to find work of some kind despite the stigma of coming from a failed merchant house. The younger son was 18. He had been considering whether to work in the family business or seek an apprenticeship elsewhere. That decision had been made for him. No merchant would take him as an apprentice now. He would need to find work outside the merchant class, perhaps as a day labourer or in some trade that did not require formal apprenticeship. Otsun's mother was 70 years old. She had lived with them since her husband's death 15 years earlier. She had never imagined spending her final years in poverty. She said nothing during Heizaemon's explanation. She simply wept quietly. The following morning, word of Heizaemon's failure began spreading through the merchant community. Such information could not be kept secret. Too many people were involved in the liquidation process. Other merchants noticed activity around his shop that indicated problems. The informal networks of information that connected Osaka's commercial district carried news rapidly. Some merchants expressed sympathy. Business failure could happen to anyone. Rice trading involved risk. Heizaemon had simply been unlucky with his timing. They indicated they bore him no ill will, and hoped the process would conclude with minimal difficulty. Others were less understanding. Heizaemon had taken excessive risk. He had violated principles of prudent management. He had endangered creditors who had trusted him. His failure would create losses for many parties. They expressed contempt for what they saw as recklessness disguised as business acumen. A few offered assistance. One merchant who had known Heizaemon's father suggested he might have a position available for the elder son once the liquidation concluded. Another indicated he would be willing to purchase inventory at fair market price, understanding this would help maximize creditor recovery. These gestures were modest, but meaningful. The liquidation proceeded over the following months. The rice inventory sold quickly. Rice was a fungible commodity. Buyers needed it regardless of why the seller was disposing of it. The prices were reasonable given current market conditions. This generated approximately 400 ryo. The collection of outstanding receivables proved more difficult. Some debts were paid promptly, others required negotiation or legal action. A few were uncollectible because the debtors themselves had financial difficulties. The process eventually recovered roughly 300 ryo, less than Heizaemon had hoped, but more than the administrator had expected. Personal possessions went through a separate process. Otsune's kimonos, which were of good quality silk despite sumptuary restrictions, were sold to a dealer in used clothing. Heizaemon's books, including some rare volumes on rice trading and commercial law, went to a bookseller. Household items, including ceramics, lacquerware, and a few pieces of furniture, found buyers. These sales generated 50 RIO total. The shop property attracted significant interest. The location near the exchange was valuable. Multiple merchants submitted offers. The administrator negotiated carefully, eventually securing a price of 700 Rio. This exceeded initial estimates and represented the largest single component of the asset recovery. The total proceeds came to approximately 1,450 REO. This would be distributed proportionally among creditors. Each would receive roughly 35% of what they were owed. The remaining 65% represented permanent losses they would have to absorb. The administrator prepared a final report documenting all transactions. He noted that Heizaemon had cooperated fully throughout the process. No evidence existed of hidden assets or attempts to defraud creditors. The liquidation had been managed efficiently and honestly. While creditors suffered losses, the process had recovered the maximum amount possible under the circumstances. During these months, Heizaemon continued working. He still had obligations under the forward contracts until the property sold and the business formally closed. He purchased rice at market prices and arranged delivery to fulfill these obligations. The losses mounted with each transaction, but he honoured every contract rather than defaulting. This adherence to obligations, despite personal catastrophe, did not go unnoticed. Several of the contract counterparties privately indicated they respected his conduct. One wrote a statement noting that Heizaemon had performed completely on all agreements, even when doing so worsened his financial position. This statement joined the one from his primary creditor in a small collection of documents that testified to his character, if not his judgment. His family adapted to changing circumstances as the liquidation progressed. They reduced food quality and quantity. They stopped purchasing new clothing. They eliminated all unnecessary expenses. They prepared for a future that would be materially much harsher than their past. Otsune proved remarkably resourceful. She had skills in sewing and household management. She began taking work from wealthier merchant families who needed clothing mended or help with complex household tasks. This generated small income that helped with immediate expenses. She approached this work without complaint or self-pity. Her family needed support. She would provide it however possible. The elder son found occasional work as a clerk for merchants willing to hire someone with relevant skills despite his family background. The work was inconsistent and poorly paid compared to what he would have earned in the family business. He took whatever was offered and performed conscientiously. The younger son struggled more. Opportunities for someone with his limited skills and problematic family history were scarce. He eventually found work helping at a warehouse, loading and unloading rice. The physical labour was exhausting. The pay barely covered his basic needs. He did it anyway because alternatives were even worse. Heizaemon himself had the most difficult time finding direction. Once the liquidation process began, his role became largely administrative. He provided information to the administrator, signed documents, attended meetings with creditors. He no longer functioned as a rice merchant because he no longer had a business to operate. He felt the weight of responsibility acutely. Every hardship his family endured resulted from his decision to take excessive risk. His wife working as a seamstress, his sons doing labour beneath their education and capability, his mother-in-law living in anxiety about her final years, all consequences of his miscalculation. The shame extended beyond his family. The creditors who would never recover their full losses, the employees he had dismissed when the liquidation began, the counterparties to transactions who had to adjust their own business plans when his situation became clear. The ripples from his failure touched many lives. He spent considerable time thinking about where his reasoning had gone wrong. The analysis of market conditions had been sound. The probability calculation had been reasonable. The expected price movements had been logical based on available information. The error had not been in the analysis, but in the position sizing. He had wagered everything on a probability rather than a certainty. His father's teaching came back to him repeatedly. Never commit more than you can afford to lose. This principle existed precisely to prevent the situation Heizaemon now faced. Business involved risk. Sometimes analysis proved wrong. Sometimes unexpected events changed outcomes. The careful merchant sized positions so that even when things went wrong, recovery remained possible. Heizaemon had convinced himself his analysis was so strong that this principle did not apply. He had treated a favourable probability as a certainty. He had confused confidence with wisdom. The distinction had cost him everything. The shop property sold in the 4th month of the liquidation process. The new owner took possession immediately. Heizaemon's family had to vacate the building. They moved to a small rental dwelling in a less desirable district of Osaka. The structure consisted of 2 rooms with a packed earth floor and a single small cooking area. The rent was minimal because the building was old and poorly maintained. The contrast with their previous life was severe. They had gone from comfortable prosperity to near poverty within months. The physical conditions of their housing reflected their changed status. They were no longer merchant class. They had fallen to the level of day labourers and marginal workers. The final distribution of assets occurred in the 6th month. The administrator called a meeting of all creditors. He presented the final accounting. Total recovery of 1,448 Oryo would be distributed proportionally. Each creditor received their share along with documentation showing the full process. Several creditors made statements at this meeting. Some expressed frustration at their losses. Others acknowledged that Heizaemon had handled an impossible situation as well as could be expected. The primary moneylender spoke at length about the importance of maintaining standards of honourable conduct even in business failure. He specifically noted Heizaemon's cooperation and transparency throughout the process. The Merchant Guild issued its formal ruling. Heizaemon would be prohibited from operating as a rice broker in Osaka. This restriction would remain in place indefinitely. However, the Guild would not recommend legal prosecution or social ostracism. His conduct during liquidation had met acceptable standards. While he had made serious errors of judgment, he had not violated ethical principles in how he managed the consequences. This ruling represented a measured response. It acknowledged the failure while recognising the honourable manner in which Heizaemon had addressed it. He would bear the consequences of his decisions, but those consequences would not extend to permanent exclusion from merchant society for his family. His elder son received an offer of employment from the merchant who had known Heizaemon's father. The position was entry-level and the compensation modest, but it represented legitimate work in a merchant house. If the son performed well, he might eventually advance despite his family background. This possibility had been preserved by his father's conduct during the liquidation. His younger son continued warehouse work but began learning carpentry from a craftsman who needed an assistant. The transition from merchant to artisan class represented downward mobility, but it offered a path to eventually supporting himself through skilled work rather than remaining in menial labour indefinitely. Otsune's sewing work expanded. She developed a reputation for skill and reliability. Several merchant wives began recommending her to others. The income remained modest but steady. Combined with what her sons earned, the family could manage basic expenses. Otsune's mother adapted to reduced circumstances with quiet dignity. She helped with household tasks to the extent her age allowed. She no longer expected comfort or luxury. She found satisfaction in small things, a warm meal, a sunny afternoon, the presence of family. Heizaemon himself struggled to find a place in this new reality. He was 51 years old. He had spent his entire adult life as a rice merchant. That identity had been stripped away. He was no longer certain who he was or what role he could serve. He eventually found work as a clerk for a sake brewer. The brewer needed someone who could read, write, keep accounts, and manage commercial correspondence. Heizaemon's skills were applicable even though the product was different. The pay was less than he had earned as an independent merchant, but it exceeded what day labourers received. The work proved surprisingly satisfying. He had no responsibility for business strategy or significant decisions. He simply performed assigned tasks competently. There was relief in this simplicity. The pressure that had characterised his life as a merchant was absent. He went to work, did what was asked, received his pay, went home. The stress that had consumed him for months gradually lessened. His relationship with Otsune slowly repaired. She had never reproached him explicitly for the disaster his speculation had caused, but tension had existed between them. The unspoken weight of what he had done, the transformation he had forced upon their lives, the uncertainty he had created. Gradually they began talking more openly. She told him she'd been angry. furious at his recklessness, terrified by the poverty they faced, exhausted by the work required to survive. But she had also recognised that he had not intended any of this. He had made what he believed was a sound business decision. It had gone wrong in ways he had not anticipated. He had then faced the consequences honourably, rather than attempting to evade them. She told him she was proud of how he had handled the liquidation. Many men would have tried to hide assets, blame others, or simply run away. He had stood his ground, admitted his failure, and worked to settle accounts fairly. That integrity mattered to her. Their material circumstances had changed, but the man she had married still existed beneath the failure. This conversation occurred on an evening in their small dwelling. They sat together after the day's work was complete. The room was sparsely furnished. The walls were bare, the floor was rough, but they had managed to make it a home. Their sons were both employed, they had enough food, they were together. Heizaemon told her he had been thinking about what he had learned. The obsession with opportunity had blinded him to risk. The confidence in his analysis had made him dismiss caution. The desire to provide abundantly for family had led him to jeopardize their basic security. He had confused ambition with wisdom. He told her that if he ever had the opportunity to build capital again, he would never take such risk. The possibility of great gain was not worth the certainty of catastrophic loss if things went wrong. He had learned this lesson at terrible cost. He would not forget it. She told him she believed him. She also told him she did not want him to spend the rest of his life dwelling on this failure. They had survived. Their family remained intact. Their sons had futures. They would likely never be prosperous again, but they could be content. That was enough. The seasons passed. Summer heat gave way to autumn cool. Winter brought cold that penetrated their inadequate dwelling. Spring arrived with warmth and renewal. Life continued in its daily rhythms. Heizaemon found satisfaction in small accomplishments. A well-maintained set of account books, a letter drafted with appropriate phrasing, accurate inventory records. These were modest contributions, but they had value. He was useful. He earned his place. His elder son performed well in his position at the merchant house. After 2 years, he received a small promotion. The path ahead remained uncertain, but possibility existed. He might eventually establish himself respectably despite his father's failure. His younger son completed his carpentry apprenticeship. He began taking small jobs on his own. The work was skilled and valued. He would never be wealthy, but he could support himself and eventually a family. This represented success of a different kind than Heizaemon had once envisioned, but it was real and sustainable. Otsune's mother died peacefully in her sleep in the 3rd year after the liquidation. She had lived to see her grandsons employed and her daughter managing in difficult circumstances. She had not ended her life in the comfort she had once known, but neither had she suffered alone or abandoned. The family had cared for her to the end. 5 years after the disaster, Heizaemon's primary creditor contacted him unexpectedly. The man had retired from active money lending and was putting his affairs in order. He wanted to see Heizaemon one more time. They met at a tea house near the Dojima Exchange. The moneylender, now aged and moving slowly, greeted Heizaemon with surprising warmth. He asked about the family. He listened to accounts of the son's employment and Otsune's sewing work. He nodded approvingly. Then he said something Heizaemon had not expected. "You lost money for me and many others. That was unfortunate. But you showed me something more valuable than money. You showed that a man could fail catastrophically and still behave with integrity. You honoured your obligations even when doing so hurt you. You worked to settle accounts fairly even though you gained nothing from it. You accepted consequences rather than evading them." He continued, "I have seen many merchant failures in my years in this business. Most involve dishonesty, evasion, or attempts to shift losses to others. Your failure was different. You made a serious error of judgment, but your character remained intact. That distinction matters in how the community assesses a man." He told Heizaemon that several merchants had privately indicated they respected how he had handled the liquidation. If Heizaemon ever had an opportunity to re-enter commerce in some capacity, these merchants would not hold the old failure against him. His conduct during disaster had preserved possibilities for the future. Heizaemon thanked him. He said he had no current plans to return to independent commerce. His work as a clerk provided adequately for his reduced needs. His ambitions had been tempered by experience. He no longer sought wealth or status. He sought sufficiency and peace. The moneylender smiled. That is perhaps the most valuable lesson of all, to recognize that sufficiency is enough. Many merchants never learn this. They chase endless expansion until they destroy themselves. You learned it through painful experience, but you learned it thoroughly. They finished their tea. They parted with mutual respect. Heizaemon returned to his dwelling. He told Otsune about the meeting. She said she was glad the moneylender had sought him out. It provided a kind of closure to the whole painful episode. That evening, Heizaemon stood outside their dwelling looking at the city. Osaka spread in all directions, bustling and prosperous. The Rice Exchange continued its business. Merchants made fortunes and lost them. Commerce flowed in its endless cycles. He had been part of that world. He had risen to modest success within it. He had made one catastrophic miscalculation and fallen out of it. Now he lived on its margins, no longer a participant in the central activities but still connected through his work and his son's employment. He thought about what might have been if he had sized his position more carefully, if he had followed his father's teaching, if he had placed prudence above ambition. The family would still occupy the shop near the exchange. His sons would be preparing to inherit a thriving business. His wife would live in comfort. His mother-in-law would have ended her life in security. But perhaps his sons would have eventually made similar mistakes without learning the lessons he had learned. Perhaps prosperity uninterrupted would have bred carelessness in the next generation. Perhaps the fall he had experienced had taught his family something valuable about resilience and adaptation. He did not know if this rationalization had merit. He suspected it was simply a way of managing the regret that would never completely leave him. He had gambled his family's future and lost. That reality could not be reframed as secretly beneficial. What he did know was that life continued. The sun rose each morning. Work needed doing. Food required preparation. Relationships demanded attention. These mundane necessities of existence remained constant regardless of one's commercial fortunes. He had learned that he could survive losing almost everything material. The loss was painful. The adjustment was difficult, but it was survivable. Some things could not be taken away by business failure. The capacity to work, the ability to maintain relationships, the possibility of finding satisfaction in modest accomplishment. These persisted even when wealth disappeared. The rice merchant who had speculated unwisely no longer existed. That person had been destroyed by his own miscalculation. What remained was a clerk who kept adequate accounts, and a man who had learned that survival itself could be an achievement. Heizaemon went inside. His family gathered for the evening meal. The food was simple, the dwelling was cramped, the circumstances were reduced. But they were together. They had made it through disaster to this quiet moment of sufficiency. The night settled over Osaka. The city sounds gradually faded. The commercial district quieted as shops closed and merchants returned to their homes. The Dojima Exchange would open again tomorrow. Rice would be bought and sold. Fortunes would be made and lost. The cycles would continue. In a small dwelling in a modest district, a man who had once been a rice merchant and his family finished their meal. They prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring more work, more small challenges, more ordinary moments that comprised a life rebuilding after catastrophe. The past could not be changed. The losses could not be recovered. But the future remained open in its small possibilities. Enough income to cover needs, enough stability to plan from one season to the next, enough peace to no longer lie awake calculating impossible margins and imagining different choices. Heizaemon lay down on the thin mat that served as his bed. Otsune lay beside him. Through the thin walls came the sounds of their neighbours settling for the night. Outside, the city continued its endless activity, though reduced in the late hours. He closed his eyes. The day's work was complete. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. This was his life now. Not what he had planned or hoped for, not what he had worked to build, but what remained after everything else had been stripped away. It was enough. Heizaemon was not the only merchant who faced such devastation. Let me tell you about Kawamoto Jinsuke, an oil merchant whose warehouse stood just 3 streets away from the Dojima Exchange. His catastrophe arrived differently, but the challenge of rebuilding was much the same. The fire started sometime after midnight on a night when the wind blew from the north. Kawamoto Jinsuke woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of his neighbours shouting. By the time he reached the street, flames had already consumed the roof of his warehouse. The oil stored inside fed the fire with terrible efficiency. The heat was so intense that people 3 buildings away had to shield their faces. The warehouse stood near the canal in Osaka's commercial district. It was a substantial wooden structure, 2 stories high, where Jinsuke stored the rapeseed oil he purchased from producers in the surrounding countryside and sold to merchants throughout the city. The building also housed his living quarters on the 2nd floor. His wife and 2 daughters were already in the street when he emerged. They had escaped with nothing but the clothes they wore and a single wooden chest his wife had managed to grab as they fled. The neighbourhood's fire brigade arrived quickly. Edo period cities maintained organised firefighting groups in each district. The men carried buckets, hooks on long poles and wet mats. But oil fires burned differently than ordinary fires. Water sometimes spread the flames rather than extinguishing them. The brigade's primary goal became preventing the fire from spreading to adjacent buildings, rather than saving the warehouse itself. Jinsuke stood in the street watching everything he owned burn. The oil made a particular sound as it burned, a roaring whoosh that was unlike wood fire alone. Occasionally something would collapse inside with a crash and spray of sparks that rose into the night sky. The heat was so fierce that the wooden buildings across the narrow street began to smoke. The fire brigade focused their efforts there, keeping those surfaces wet, creating a barrier the fire could not cross. The warehouse burned through the night. By dawn, only the stone foundation remained. The wooden structure had collapsed entirely into a heap of charred beams and ash. The roof tiles had fallen inward. Nothing recognisable remained of the contents. The oil had burned completely. The living quarters on the 2nd floor were gone. All the household possessions, business records and stored goods had been destroyed. Jinsuke was 53 years old. He had inherited the oil business from his father 30 years earlier. The warehouse had been in the family for 2 generations. He had expanded the operation over the years, building relationships with producers in multiple regions, establishing regular customers among restaurants, bathhouses, and other merchants who used oil in various applications. The business had been prosperous enough to support his family comfortably and provide employment for 3 workers who helped with the heavy labour of moving oil barrels. Now he stood looking at ruins. His wife and daughters were safe, which was the most important thing, but everything else was gone. The building itself, the inventory of oil, the barrels and containers, the scales and measuring equipment, the records showing who owed him money and whom he owed, the savings kept in a locked box in his living quarters, all destroyed. The immediate problem was shelter. Neighbours offered temporary accommodation. His family crowded into a room in another merchant's house. The space was small, and they had to be careful not to impose on their host's hospitality. They borrowed clothing and basic necessities. His daughters, aged 15 and 12, tried to help with household tasks to show gratitude for the kindness shown them. Jinsuke spent the first days after the fire trying to understand the full extent of his losses. He had been insured through a mutual aid society that merchants in the district maintained. Members paid regular contributions. When fire or other disaster struck, the society provided compensation to help rebuild, but the amount available was limited. It would cover perhaps 1/3 of the cost of constructing a new warehouse. He would need to find additional funds to rebuild completely. The lost inventory represented a larger problem. He had owned approximately 200 barrels of rapeseed oil at the time of the fire. At current market prices, that oil was worth roughly 400 ryo. It was completely unrecoverable. He had already paid the producers for that oil. The money was gone. He could not simply order new oil without funds to purchase it. His business had operated on relationships as much as capital. The producers he bought from extended credit based on their trust in his ability to pay after he sold the oil. The customers he sold to paid upon delivery or shortly thereafter. This system worked because of established patterns and mutual confidence. The fire had disrupted everything. Producers would be hesitant to extend credit to someone who had just lost all their assets. Customers would question his ability to deliver future orders. Jinsuke walked through the ruins once they had cooled enough to approach. The stone foundation was intact but blackened. The iron fittings that had reinforced the door frame remained, twisted by heat. Everything else was ash and charcoal. He could identify where certain things had been by their position. Here was where the storage barrels had stood, there was where the scale had hung, but the actual objects were destroyed beyond recovery. He found the remains of the locked box where he had kept his savings. The fire had been so hot that the lock had melted. The coins inside had fused into a misshapen lump of metal. They were technically still valuable, but they would need to be melted down and recast before they could be used. This would cost money he did not have. Even his emergency reserves had been rendered temporarily useless by the fire. The cause of the fire remained uncertain. Jinsuke had been careful about fire safety. Oil businesses faced particular risks. He had maintained strict rules about lamps and cooking fires. He had inspected the building regularly for any damage or wear that might create hazards. But fires started sometimes despite precautions. A spark from a neighbour's chimney. A lamp knocked over in the night. A piece of smouldering charcoal that had seemed extinguished but reignited. The exact origin might never be known. What mattered now was rebuilding. Jinsuke visited the Mutual Aid Society to claim his compensation. The society's administrators inspected the ruins and confirmed the fire's extent. They calculated the payment he would receive based on the building's size and the society's current funds. The amount came to 200 oryo, substantial, but insufficient for complete reconstruction. He would need to borrow additional money. This meant approaching moneylenders or seeking loans from other merchants. His reputation before the fire had been good. He had operated honestly for 3 decades. He had never defaulted on an obligation or cheated a business partner. This reputation now represented his most valuable remaining asset. He visited several potential lenders. He explained his situation candidly. The fire had destroyed his physical assets, but not his relationships or knowledge of the oil trade. He knew which producers had the best quality oil. He knew which customers were reliable and which required careful management. He could rebuild the business if he had capital to purchase initial inventory and construct a new warehouse. Some lenders declined. The risk seemed too high. A man who had lost everything to fire might not recover. The oil market was competitive. Younger merchants with intact operations might capture his former customers while he struggled to rebuild. The loan might never be repaid. Other lenders were more receptive. One man who had known Jinsuke's father agreed to lend 300 oryo at reasonable interest rates. Another merchant who had himself recovered from fire damage years earlier offered 200 ryo. Combined with the insurance payment, Jinsuke would have 700 ryo, enough to construct a smaller warehouse and purchase initial inventory to restart operations. The construction process would take months. Carpenters needed to be hired, lumber purchased, roof tiles ordered, stonemasons would repair the foundation where necessary. The work proceeded slowly but steadily. Jinsuke visited the site daily, watching the new structure take shape. It would be smaller than the original warehouse. He would need to be more selective about what inventory he maintained, but it would be functional. While construction proceeded, Jinsuke worked to rebuild his business relationships. He visited producers he had worked with for years. He explained his situation. He asked if they would be willing to extend credit for initial oil purchases once his warehouse was complete. Most agreed, though some reduced the credit terms. Instead of 60 days to pay, they wanted 30. Instead of large quantities on credit, they would start with smaller amounts until he demonstrated ability to pay. He visited his former customers, restaurants that fried food, bathhouses that used oil in their lamps, merchants who resold oil to smaller retailers. He told them he would be back in business within 4 months. He asked if they would resume purchasing from him when he was ready. Many said yes, though some had already established relationships with other suppliers who had filled the gap created by his absence. His family adapted to their reduced circumstances. They remained in borrowed lodging. His wife took work doing sewing for other merchant families. His elder daughter helped at a neighbour's shop. His younger daughter assisted her mother with sewing. The money they earned was modest, but it helped with daily expenses and demonstrated their willingness to work rather than relying entirely on charity. Jinsuke himself took temporary work at another oil merchant's warehouse. The merchant needed help during a busy season. Jinsuke's knowledge of the oil trade made him valuable despite his current situation. The work was physical and exhausting. He had not done such labour regularly in years, since he had hired workers to handle the heavy barrels. But he did it without complaint. He needed income. He also needed to remain visible in the merchant community, demonstrating that he was still active and reliable. The months passed. The warehouse neared completion. Jinsuke arranged for delivery of his first shipment of oil from a producer he had worked with for 20 years. 50 barrels, a fraction of his former inventory, but a start. He arranged to borrow additional barrels and containers from other merchants until he could afford to purchase his own. The merchant community's willingness to help demonstrated that his reputation had survived the fire. The new warehouse was simpler than the original, 1 story instead of 2, smaller storage capacity, but it was well built and functional. Jinsuke and his family moved into new rented lodging nearby rather than living above the warehouse as they had before. The separation of business and home meant additional expense but also reduced risk. If fire struck again, their living space would not be destroyed along with the business. He received his first customers in the new warehouse 6 months after the fire. A restaurant owner who had purchased from him for 15 years placed an order. A bathhouse operator who valued the quality of Jinsuke's oil ordered several barrels. Word spread that Kawamoto Jinsuke was back in business. Orders came in gradually, not at the volume he had handled before the fire, but enough to begin generating revenue. The first loan payments came due. Jinsuke paid them on time from his new business income. This was crucial. If he defaulted, he would lose all credibility. His lenders watched carefully to see if he could manage the debt burden while rebuilding operations. Meeting these obligations, even when money was tight, demonstrated his commitment to honouring agreements. His family adjusted to a different standard of living. They would not return to their former comfort for years, if ever. The debt burden meant that most revenue had to go toward loan repayment and business operations. Little remained for personal expenses. They ate simpler food. They wore clothing mended multiple times. They spent nothing on entertainment or luxuries. But they were surviving. The business was functioning. Progress was being made. Jinsuke reflected often on the difference between his situation and what it might have been. If the fire had occurred 20 years earlier, when he was younger and still establishing himself, recovery might have been impossible. He would have lacked the relationships and reputation necessary to secure loans and rebuild customer base. If it had occurred 10 years later, when he was older and had less energy, he might have lacked the stamina to do the physical work required during reconstruction. The timing, while terrible, had occurred when he still had enough years and ability to recover. This seemed less like luck and more like the arbitrary nature of disaster. Fire did not choose its moment based on what was convenient. It struck when conditions allowed it to burn. All one could do was respond to circumstances as they existed. The oil trade continued as it always had. Rice farmers pressed their rapeseed crops to extract oil. Merchants transported barrels through canal networks to urban centres. Customers purchased oil for cooking, lighting, and various applications. The individual merchants involved in this trade rose and fell. Some prospered, some failed. Some, like Jinsuke, experienced catastrophe and then slowly rebuilt. 2 years after the fire, Jinsuke's business had stabilised at perhaps 60% of its former scale. He handled smaller volumes, but his operation was profitable. He was meeting all debt obligations on schedule. His family had moved into modest but adequate housing. His daughters were both working, the elder as an assistant to a fabric merchant, the younger helping her mother with increasingly successful sewing business. The new warehouse would never match the old one. Jinsuke had accepted this. He was rebuilding something functional rather than trying to recreate what had been lost. This more modest ambition was actually liberating. He no longer felt pressure to expand operations or maximize every opportunity. He focused on steady, reliable business that met obligations and provided for basic needs. He thought sometimes about what he would tell someone else facing similar disaster. The immediate aftermath felt overwhelming. The losses seemed irreplaceable. But time and consistent effort changed perspective. What seemed impossible in the first weeks after the fire had been accomplished through months and years of patient work. Not dramatic recovery, not restoration to former glory, but survival and basic functionality. The merchant community had supported him, but only because he had earned that support through decades of honest dealing before the fire. A newer merchant or someone with questionable reputation might not have received the same help. The relationships built over 30 years had proven to be his most valuable asset when everything else was destroyed. His family's resilience had been equally crucial. His wife's willingness to work, his daughter's adaptation to reduced circumstances without complaint. Their collective effort had made survival possible. If they had depended entirely on his earnings, the burden would have been crushing. Their contributions, while individually modest, had provided crucial margins during the most difficult months. The evening settled over Osaka. Lamps were lit throughout the merchant district. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The canal reflected the fading daylight. Jinsuke closed his warehouse for the day. He checked that lamps were properly extinguished. He verified that all barrels were secured. He was perhaps overly cautious about fire safety now, but given what he had experienced, this caution seemed justified. He walked to his family's lodging through familiar streets. The route took him past where his old warehouse had stood. A different building occupied that plot now. The new owner operated a fabric storage business. Jinsuke felt no particular emotion seeing another enterprise in that location. The past was past. What mattered was that he was still operating, still supporting his family, still engaged in the work he knew how to do. His wife had prepared a simple evening meal: rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables. His daughters helped serve. They ate together, talking about the day's activities. These ordinary moments had value he had not fully appreciated before the fire. The comfort of routine, the presence of family, the fact of having shelter and food. Jinsuke lay down to sleep that night thinking about the next day's business. A producer was delivering 30 barrels of fresh oil. 2 customers had placed orders that would be filled from that shipment. The margins would be modest, but adequate. The work would continue as it had for months now. Not spectacular, not particularly dramatic, but steady and sustainable. The fire had been devastating. The recovery had been exhausting. But here he was, still operating, still providing for his family, still engaged in the merchant's life. That represented a kind of success, even if it was not the success he had once enjoyed. He had survived. He had adapted. He continued. The night was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city. Jinsuke's breathing slowed as sleep approached. Tomorrow would bring more work, more small challenges, more incremental progress. The pattern would repeat day after day. This was how life proceeded for merchants in Edo period Osaka. Not through dramatic triumphs, but through persistent, steady effort over time. The oil trade continued. The merchants adapted. The city lived and breathed and conducted its business. And Kawamoto Jinsuke remained part of it all. Diminished but not destroyed. Changed but still functioning. Reduced in scale but still engaged in the work that defined him.